Chapter 1. The Prologue. Run, son. The voice echoed through the woods, drowned out by clashing swords. Through the woods, a young boy ran for his life, terrified of the sound of the swords clanging behind him. A tall, commanding figure stood in a clearing behind the boy, swinging his blade up to defend himself. Black flames surrounded his boots and coated the ground, growing larger every step back from the attack. The swords met again, sliding across one another with a whine. The man looked up at his opponent, daunt seeping through him like ice. Fiery, dilated eyes glared back at him, set in a horned steel mask, rigid as his blade and black as midnight. The flaming black shadow stood well over the man, its very existence sapping the light from the sky and the flames that burned among them. The boy hid behind a thick tree not far from where he ran, gaining his breath. He opened his hand, a necklace bound in gold thread glowing in his palm, the blue crystal in the center glimmering in the small light from the moon peeking through the canopy. Flinching at the sound of a pained yell, the boy peered his head around the tree. The man lay defeated on the ground, with a deep gash on his arm, his sword in the scorched dirt beside him. The dark figure stalked over to him, its weapon dangling from its right hand and scraping the ground as it moved, sparks spitting from the sword as it brushed the stones scattered across the dirt. The man looked up at the demon-like shadow, his eyes wide as he clutched at his wound. The figure stood over the man in victory, the flames roiling off its shoulders and lapping at the air.
Just like the legend said, the king will fall, and let that be true.
It growled, its voice deep like thunder. A new king will rise. He will bring peace to Braina. The man spat, his voice steady as he rose to his feet.
King Benjamin, how naive you've become.
The figure mocked, a shadowy grin peeking from under the fiery embrace. The born king is destined to rise, and you cannot change that, the king said, defiance entering his voice.
But you will fall.
The figure smirked.
And you cannot stop that.
The king jolted sharply, groaning with pain. He looked down, the sword's tip embedded into him, blood slowly pouring out of the wound. Pain flared through his body, and his knees gave out, sending him back to the ground, his hand holding the blade. A line of blood dripped from his sliced palm, crimson staining the charred grass. Gravity overtook him, and he fell to his side, facing the boy in the woods. The king's lips moved slowly, the light in his eyes fading as he whispered to him, "Run, Arthur. Run." The young boy felt tears dripping down his cheeks as he watched him bleed out on the ground, flicking his eyes up to the figure. In a flick of movement, the figure sharply turned its head to the boy. Bright amber eyes glared at him, piercing through the black flames and staring right into Arthur's eyes as if they'd burn him from the inside out. A fearful cry pierced through the air, and Arthur sprang up in fright, panting heavily. Looking around with wide eyes, he took in the familiar surroundings of his bedroom. Bedroom. Reality. Right. Realizing it was all a dream, he calmed himself slowly, his eyes flicking around the room for any sign of the figure he saw, to no avail. He breathed slowly, calming his racing heart. Rubbing his eyes, Arthur moved himself over to the edge of the bed. That was the first time the figure had looked at him. Every other time, it was just his silhouette and voice, the dark skeletal face with cracks and breaks and those orange glowing eyes. Arthur sighed, looking over to his bedside table, the same necklace he held in the nightmare resting atop it. He frowned at it, picking it up warily and hooking it around his neck. He got up out of his bed, walking over to his wardrobe in the left corner, a mirror seated beside it. He looked at himself, his green eyes irritated at his dirty blonde hair askew from the pillows. He dragged his fingers lightly through it, studying the faint stubble dusted on his jaw. He'd need a shave soon. He opened his wardrobe, pulling out whatever his hands grabbed first, a black fur coat with regular dark brown trousers. He threw them onto his bed before pulling out a pair of socks and brown leather boots. Arthur stepped out of his bedroom fully dressed, heading down the long narrow hallway. The walls were filled with ancient artifacts, mannequins with beaten pieces of armor sitting behind glass panes, broken shards of swords and axes and all other weapons framed beside them with names of famed knights engraved into small plaques at the bottom. He made his way down the flight of spiral stairs leading to the lower portion of the castle, torches lighting the way down. The floor glimmered at the foot of the stairs, pearlescent swirls decorating the light marble. A length of red carpet stretched down the hall, reaching to the edge of the tall entryway and splitting around the two turns at the end of the walkway. He made his way through the twisting castle walls, his feet leading him through narrow hallways, the wooden doors left ajar with servants buzzing through their jobs. A few of the king's guards passed Arthur, exchanging small, respectful nods. Arthur nodded back, continuing his way forth. Further down the hallway, a larger door sat propped open, warm light pooling out along the floor. Arthur observed the kitchen from the doorway. Polished lightwood topped the benches, and wood shelves harboured bowls and plates stacked high above one another. Different types of crockery and equipment dangled from the low-hanging ceiling, their shadows sitting over the assorted blocks of utensils. Pots sat above the wood-fire oven boiling away in the tidy kitchen, a symphony of crackling from multiple pans dotting the sides around the pots. An elderly woman stood at a bench, lining plates and cutlery out for preparation, her apron smeared with grease and splashed up food. Arthur walked in, surprised to see the woman up this early without any help from the castle maidens. He peered at the small clock on the other side of the wall. The time displayed 5 in the morning. Arthur supposed she wouldn't have been up for another hour or so. She'd been busy after the feast last night that the king organised, the meals becoming a common occurrence lately. Nobody knew what the meetings were for, but rumours did have a hold in Arthur's head. Arthur strolled quietly toward the bench, a smile falling onto his lips. The woman didn't notice him, gathering another stack of plates off the cupboard, her arms shaking at the weight. Arthur moved to her, gently taking them from her grasp. The woman looked up at Arthur with a crinkled smile. Her warm face was one of the reasons Arthur would come to check on her. Her speckled grey hair and kind brown eyes gave anyone who met her a sense of comfort that extended to her infinite kindness and patience. Arthur had been fortunate enough to have since he was little.
"Thank you, Arthur,"
she said kindly, her voice not yet cracked with age.
Up early today, Miss Enid?
He asked, setting the plates in the same order as the others.
"Your uncle had a feast last night, the 3rd one this week,"
she replied, taking over the job deftly.
"He wanted another one for this morning."
Arthur walked over to the sink, grabbed some plates from the night before already stacked on the side, and began to wash them in the basin.
He must have something important enough happening to have so many meetings.
He shrugged, not quite believing the words himself.
"He is your uncle after all. He's always busy."
Enid muttered. She wasn't wrong. The King of Camelot never had much time to sit down and think, let alone spend time with family.
Wouldn't surprise me if it was about the uprising near Katerina,
Arthur said, rinsing the suds off the bowls and setting them aside to dry.
News has been springing up about that down in the marketplace, from the travellers.
"Sam Quill mentioned that, I believe."
She agreed.
Seems like a situation for the Knights of the Roundtable to handle,
Arthur said, placing the rest of the dishes away and wiping his hands dry on his trousers. He walked over to a basket on the bench beside small tubs of spices, lifting the lid open only to find it empty. He frowned, closing the lid and straightening it.
"They had the last of the bread. I came here to prepare you and your uncle breakfast, but I found it empty."
Enid muttered with irritation, dishing out the food prepared from the pots and pans, boiled eggs and crispy bacon piled up on each serving.
I'll head down to the Londinium markets and get some more,
Arthur said, straightening his jacket.
"No need, son,"
Enid assured him.
"The next delivery should be in by the afternoon."
A lady like you shouldn't need to wait on bread deliveries.
Arthur shook his head.
I was heading down anyway.
"You're too kind, Arthur."
Enid said, a smile stretching across her face. Arthur gave her a slight smile, heading out of the kitchen.
I'll be back soon.
He dawdled towards the high gates, flicking his eyes past the same old boring architecture that surrounded him 24/7. Arthur thought the castle could do with a facelift. Perhaps the bricks needed a clean. Moss was indeed growing in that crack fur. Voices echoed down the hallway, coming from the room 2 doors down. The words grew louder as he neared, too loud for Arthur not to eavesdrop. Arthur stood beside the 2 doors, leaning against the wall and peering inside slowly. A large round table sat in the centre along with 12 seats, 3 of them empty. Men dressed in fine attire sat around the table, wine goblets and half-empty platters strewn around them. His uncle sat on the left side of the table, wearing a jewelled crown on his head. The others wore finely crafted jackets, different coloured accents adorning the collars on their formal white and orange coats. The men gathered around the table paid no attention to Arthur, too focused on the conversation. The knight in the red-accented coat, a blond man with sharp silver eyes, spoke up.
If Ariandel overtakes Katerina, what does that mean for us?
Our defences are too vulnerable for a frontal assault. We cannot afford to lose more than a few hundred knights.
The blue coat added, his hands neatly folded on the table. His dark hair was pulled back in a hair tie away from his bearded face, blue eyes watching the king.
And with fewer trainees joining our ranks nowadays, we stand less of a chance leading troops into battle,
The gold coat said. His dark skin and hair matched his eyes, intelligence writhing in them.
What are your suggestions, sire?
The king turned his head to look at him, one leg crossed over the other, his hand folded beneath his chin. His dark brown eyes trailed over each of the knights, disinterest clear in his gaze. The king picked up his glass of wine slowly, swirling the dark liquid inside.
The reasonable yet riskier approach to this situation is to confront Ariandel of their transgressions against the kingdom of Katerina. We cannot allow Camelot to suffer the same fate. We will not allow this kingdom to fall.
Reuben is right, sire. Our defences are too few to start another war.
The redcoat reminded him.
The Legion is filled with new men barely a year out of their traineeship, some of them earlier than others, and even then we have nowhere near enough numbers to take them on. A formal meeting with Ariandel is out of the question. King Solomon made that clear when we tried the first time.
You're all knights of the Roundtable, are you not?
The king gritted out, irritation on his face.
And you're all the men of many stories. I'm sure you can figure it out.
That's beyond the point. Even with our rank and skill, we cannot take on an entire kingdom of barons, and the gods know who else they've allied themselves with.
Reuben answered.
Precisely.
The knight in gold added.
Even though we are knights of the Round Table, the other knights of Camelot don't stand a chance to fend for themselves against such a dangerous enemy, especially not with the likes of Dolorous Guard if the rumours are true.
Sir Lawsaw,
The king started, raising his brow slightly.
I would have thought you to be above listening to the common squabbles rumours. Dolorous Guard drows meeting in the middle with Ariandal's barons is simply ridiculous.
Larsaw's brows twitched, his face staying immovable.
Sometimes it is wise to listen to the people of the city you protect to know if a threat needs to be defended from,
He said, his voice low.
It's no use waiting on words from other kingdoms on enemy movements if they come too late to tell us, let alone local crimes and issues.
King Urgot,
The redcoat interjected before he could retort.
with all due respect to your prioritization of our kingdom's safety, there hasn't been a word against us to consider them a threat as of yet. If we move now, we could be accused of inciting a war purely out of spite against them. That could make our situation worse. I don't think it wise if we throw a needless war into the mix of our current issues of trying to gain the city's trust and faith in the throne, since it hasn't proven to get any better in the years you've ruled. Many people think your rule on the throne is redundant. I couldn't imagine what people would think of you if you brought them anarchy instead of the safety you promised them.
Watch your words, Sam Creel.
Urgot sniped, glowering at the knight and setting his hand on the armrest.
I will not have you utter treason inside this castle unless you want your title revoked.
I am representing the city's voice.
Sam Creel replied, vexation sharp in his eyes.
I have my right to express any concerns, whether public or private, and so does everyone else in this room.
Only one person's opinion matters, and that is my own.
Urgot snorted, his fingers clutching the chair tightly. Sam Creel's jaw flickered, his stare unwavering. The knights at the table shifted uncomfortably. Arthur could feel the tension in the air, as if it were a cat brushing his leg.
Sire,
Reuben cleared his throat, adjusting in his seat.
what if you fall? Who will be king?
Urgot flicked his eyes to Reuben.
King George will be taking over if I fall.
Reghead. Why?
The large knight across from Reuben asked quizzically, his coat emblazoned with burnt orange. His sizable brown beard framed his dark blue eyes, and short clipped hair covered his broad head.
It's my personal belief that King George is capable of leading in my stead,
Urgot said matter-of-factly.
should the need ever arise.
And what of the Crown Prince?
Lawsaw protested, nodding outside of the door. Arthur blinked, backing away from the door slightly.
Does he know I'm here?
Isn't he destined to be king? He is the son of Benjamin.
The green coat knight asked, looking around with a raised brow to the other knights and scratching his short black goatee, brown eyes questioning under spiky black hair.
You have a point, Arkin. The boy is destined to be king.
The knight in black nodded, leaning back in his chair and fiddling with his fork. Blue eyes widened slightly under preened black hair as he dropped the fork, frowning.
Arthur is not ready for that type of role, and he never will be.
Urgot growled, his back straight and a scowl deep on his face, his hands clenched in a death grip on the armrests. The room fell silent, the knights facing Ergot. Arthur's heart sank to the ground bitterly, his eyes scowling at the floor.
Of course, he still believed that.
It wasn't as if Arthur hadn't tried to talk with him about it. Years of tension and disbelief from Ergot had built up Arthur's resentment for his uncle, and it wasn't going to change today.
You cannot deny the boy his birthright, Ergot,
Samquil warned.
He is not fit for the role. His father should have known that before his passing.
Ergot bit, watching Sam with disdain.
You cannot speak about King Benjamin in that way. Your own brother.
The light blue coat knight protested, anger knitting his brows closer together. Green eyes glared at the king, light brown hair pushed back behind his ears with a dash of stubble coating his jaw. Ergot glared at him, and Natan glared right back, then blinked in shock. Arthur peered through the doorway as the knights fell silent again, trying to see what was happening. The knights were watching Ergot with looks of surprise, their bodies rigid. Reuben's eyes flicked to the door, Arthur pulling back quickly, dread flooding his chest.
What did they see?
You must see the potential in Arthur, surely. Benjamin would have wanted him to take over Camelot. I don't understand why you see differently,
Samquil added, his voice quieter than before.
My brother was naive.
He growled, bracing his hands on the armrests of his seat.
He was too wrapped up in his own beliefs of fantastical worlds and equality. Arthur will not be the king, even if it is his birthright.
The people believe in the boy. Is he not the king's son?
Lawsaw argued, leaning forwards.
The city points to its beliefs as they were taught to. They need their leader,
Taran added. Ergot frowned.
They already have one, me.
He spat.
The people are looking for guidance and a king who brings them peace and ease of life, not war and hardship.
Sam's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white.
This conversation is over. Get your troops ready for our departure in 2 days. Do not keep me waiting,
Ergot commanded, standing up from his seat and storming out towards the staircase at the back of the room. The knights watched as Ergot dismissed himself. Samquil snorted in anger and pushed himself away from the table, standing up with a growl. Arthur felt conflicted, processing everything he'd overheard.
The Born King? That couldn't be me. All of the prophecies were just myths.
He frowned, moving away from the door and continuing his way to the high gates, too caught up inside his mind to notice the attention of the guards he'd passed along his way through the castle courtyard. He opened the side door next to the gates, stepping outside of the castle boundaries. Below the steep castle steps lay the sparse city of Londinium, a cluster of stone and wooden buildings and marketplaces on scattered small hilltops surrounding the sparse banks of the Castoral River that cut through the kingdom like a serpent. The sun behind him rose steadily to set the city alight, illuminating the separate districts like lines on a compass. The clock tower in the north began to chime, its mighty bells ringing across the city to reach his ears. Sighing deeply to himself, Arthur walked down the castle steps. A cool breeze hit him as the wind picked up, the smell of spruce trees, pine needles, and wood smoke as familiar as family. Flags brandishing the kingdoms of Braenor blew heartily alongside the steps on tall poles, standing strong as soldiers. One in particular caught Arthur's eye, the flag of Camelot, an orange wyvern on a white background, its body bunched and pouncing through the air. Arthur watched it flap around, his brows flicking up as its rings snapped, sending it off into the wild gales. His eyes trailed its journey as it flew towards the city, the sunlight shining on the thin fabric outlining the wyvern perfectly. He smiled faintly at the flag, burying his hands in his coat pockets and beginning his descent towards the streets of Londinium.